This is the free audiobook of Elemental Power. If you haven't heard the previous chapters, you'll find the link to the playlist in the description below. You can start at chapter 1 or just pick up where you left off. Book 1, Shattered. Chapter 16, Land of Blood. When the rumble of conversation died away, I woke from a fitful nap. The spies had returned to their places at the castle. The tent was quiet. I noticed Gable, sitting in the middle by the fire, with his head in his hands. The others were standing around him, but keeping their distance. He was weeping softly to himself. He looked up and saw me then. There was anguish in his eyes. He was uncomfortable, agitated. His head shook slowly from side to side, his eyes wide with terror. "What's the matter?" I asked, sitting up. Gable was a drama queen, and this didn't alarm me very much. I wished for some hot tea, and a mug appeared in my hands, just the way I liked it. "This is a land of blood," he said. "There is blood on my hands, Lillian's blood. It torments me here." The agony rang clear in his voice. "You didn't kill Lillian," I corrected, confused by his guilt. "I did," he said. "I did. It was me. I let Glenn think it was the trolls, but it was me." My heart grew cold. What? When I came to her after several moons and found she had borne his child, I snapped. I stabbed her and the child. Afterward, I came back to myself and realized what I'd done. I ran. I have been tormented ever since. Wine was the only thing that would make me forget, that would give me a moment's peace. Now that I have abandoned that crutch, all I see is their faces again, the look in her eyes when I struck her, the blood rushing out from her beautiful heart, the innocence of the child, his life extinguished by my hand. It has all returned to me. I deserve it, but I am too weak. I left them there and ran. I didn't even have the courage to bury them. As he talked, his emotions grew more overwhelming. He was weeping openly now, slinging snot and tears and spitting as he talked. The others stood around him, disgust on every face, including mine. "Does Glenn know?" "No," he said. "Tell him if you must one day. But I beg you, don't tell him while I live. I cannot bear to be haunted by his face as well. I just can't." He dissolved into grief, crumpled in the dirt. For some reason, I wasn't much surprised by his admission. It rang with truth and regret. It explained so much. I rose, knelt beside him, and pulled his chin upward to make him face me. "Gable Ellenville, you're an adulterer and a murderer." I forced myself to meet his anguished eyes and hold them locked with mine. "You are forgiven. Not because I have any power to forgive on behalf of your victims, but because I know that you're forgiven. You have been since it happened. Accept it. As long as you live with the burden of guilt, you remain as you were in that moment. Accept that you're forgiven and become a brother and friend again. You must, to save Glenn." He sniffed and wiped his face with both hands, dragging his cheeks downward as he did so. His perfectly groomed beard was no longer trimmed. It was wild, like the heart within. I felt pity for him, but now was no time for regrets. It was time for action. "We need to go," I said to the others, standing up. "Gable, clean yourself up and come with us. It's time." Within 5 minutes we were packed and standing under the bubble of fire I had set around our camp. With a flick of my wrist, the fire extinguished, and we walked directly toward the castle of Rune. This was where it had all started 1,000 years, ages ago. The warlord had crawled out of the dead spring and spread his wickedness wherever he went, destroying the land of the dwarves. It truly was a land of blood. "They are approaching," Taryn said. It looked like the aftermath of a nuclear blast. The trees had no leaves and very few branches. They were stripped and burned, but without the rejuvenating effect fire normally had in a forest. Everything here remained dead. The sky was dark with the night, but the tiny slivers of the waning moons were hiding behind the clouds. It felt as if we were walking through a graveyard on Halloween night. Shadows flitted between the trees all around us. The fairies were watching. Taking no chances, I set the dome of fire around us again and saw the shadows dash back into the cover of darkness. They had been advancing. I kept the dome moving as we walked. Peta began to defend us, sending sprays of flame like solar flares out whenever she saw a shadow move. Her aim was impressive. We left 20 or so fairies burning to death in our wake. She never broke her forceful stride, merely directed the flame darts with her arms, not checking to see if she missed or not. She didn't usually miss. Terran seemed upset at having been left out of the fun. He began to attack. Spotting a fairy, he threw his hands up, and the earth swallowed the shadow and dragged it down beneath the soil. I clapped him heartily on the back, and he beamed at me. His teeth were yellowed by the firelight, but easily conveyed his joy. Boreas and Marlowe joined the fighting. Boreas swept up the shadows in a whirlwind, sending them spinning off to their death far away, plummeting down from hundreds of feet above the ground. Marlowe sent waves at them using the puddles around us as his source. The whole land was damp and dank and dismal. There was plenty of ammunition for a water sprite. The fairies began to shrink away, not risking death at the hands of the 4 elemental warriors. I felt like a badass imposter walking beneath an umbrella of fire. My warriors were clearing the path for me, and my man was about to be rescued by the princess of the elemental world. I could see the front gate now. The castle of Rune looked like a ruinous medieval fortress overgrown with moss and surrounded by death. We all began to run, eating up the yards in seconds, fueled by the expectation of victory. There were fairies on the drawbridge attempting to block our passage. Peta and Boreas made short work of destroying them, sending them spinning up in fire tornadoes. The enormous wooden door was barred, and we heard the fairies' laughter from inside. A rush of wind swirled around Boreas, speaking with the sound of wind in the trees, and he nodded. "They have gathered around Glenn. This sprite will lead us to him. Get that door open, Terran." Terran flexed his massive muscles, smashed his spiked mace through the door with incredible force. Several blows later, we burst into the courtyard of the fairies, and the elementals destroyed any fairies who dared confront us. The castle was decorated with statues of the most intense evil I'd ever seen. They were simply chiseled stone, but incredibly disturbing nonetheless. They looked like gargoyles would if gargoyles had half-human cousins. Teeth and talons and bat-like wings adorned every one of them. Their eyes were blank and large, but they gave the impression that they saw everything around them. I shivered and put them out of my mind. Boreas led the way, running with his feet barely touching the ground. He followed the wind sprite who was leading us to Glenn. The hopeless desperation of the past days melted from me and lay discarded in a heap with the broken doors in the courtyard. Joy and hope filled me, and I felt as if I was glowing. Looking down, I saw that I really was glowing. My skin was actually emitting light. That was weird. Gable, who was running beside me, pulled my arm and ground to a halt to stop me. The others stopped and waited impatiently for him, panting. Terran and Marlowe circled around us, facing outward, ready to strike. They all looked at me strangely, noticing the change in my skin tone. "It's a trap," Gable said. "The spirits are warning me. Lillian is warning me. The wind sprite is a decoy, a traitor. Glenn isn't here." "Then where is he?" Peta spat, visibly agitated. Sparks were shooting from the lifted ends of her fire-red hair. Marlowe stepped away a few paces, still facing the enemy-infested darkness. Gable shut his eyes and clutched at his head. It obviously caused him pain to do this, but I wasn't about to stop him. "The dead spring," he shouted. "Out! Everybody out! Now!" I took the lead, tearing back through the fairy castle toward the doors we'd just smashed through. The drawbridge had been raised, blocking our way. Terran wasted no time smashing through it. There was water below, swirling with all kinds of foul creatures. Crocodiles leapt up and snapped, barely missing my toes as I leaned out over the expanse, crestfallen. "Don't worry, Princess. I'll get us across," Terran said. He'd prostrated himself on the base of the stone where the bridge usually rested. He began turning to stone himself and extending his body across the moat. When he reached the opposite side, he yelled, "Now!" We all ran across his petrified back safely to the other side. His feet snapped to his body across the water, and he was up and running behind us as we dashed into the woods. I had no idea where we were supposed to go, not knowing the dead spring's location in relation to the castle. I knew it wasn't terribly close, because I hadn't seen the castle when I'd emerged nearly a month ago. Had it really only been a month? It seemed like a lifetime. Something was leading me, though. I knew where to go without my brain knowing why. We were all running, fueled by adrenaline and fear. We didn't tire, didn't stumble. We kept on running. After about an hour, we burst into a clearing, and there was the dead spring, just as I remembered it. I suddenly found myself in a tremendous amount of pain as I ground to a halt a few feet in front of the spring. I looked down at my arms and saw them slashed and bleeding, just as they had been the first time I was here. There was a great deal of blood soaking through my coat from the newly reopened flaying. My lips were cracked and my face swelled. I could barely breathe through my nose and my eyes closed to slits. It was as if I had just now floated to the top of the water, nearly dead. Terror clamped its suffocating hands over my mouth. A hooded figure stood up from behind a smattering of trees that surrounded the spring and pulled Glenn to his feet. He was as bloody and battered as I was, but still alive, still mine, and I took a step toward him. All of my anger and hatred became focused on Glenn's captor. "You've come a long way, daughter of Lort," he said. "Not far enough, I'm afraid." The head snapped back and the hood fell away, revealing one of the gray-suited creatures like the monks that had tormented me my whole life. His voice was oddly familiar. I knew I'd heard it before. "Give me my husband," I commanded. When I spoke, the earth shook beneath us. Had I done that? "Gladly," he said, and pushed Glenn toward me. Glenn took one ragged step, and then surprise transformed his features. He turned to look back at the gray, and I saw it. A stone knife sticking from his back. I screamed and ran to him, catching him as he fell to the ground. I held out a hand toward the murderer, willing him a painful death. He exploded, sending bits of gray flesh shooting outward, landing in my hair and littering the ground around us. A shockwave of fire expanded from me, the flames killing everything within the blast zone of my fury. Screams from burning fairies howled in every direction. Only my friends were safe, here by the spring of death. I was on the ground, cradling Glenn on my lap. Gable rushed over and looked at his face. I could see them both clearly in the aftermath of my rage, blighted trees alight and casting reddish glows over the scene. Glenn was fading, the light passing from his eyes, leaving the gold-flecked blue hollow and dimensionless. Gable knelt beside him. "Glenn, my brother, please forgive me. Accept this as my final gift. And remember me always in this moment. Remember me as I am now. Goodbye, brother," he said, kissing Glenn's dying face and pulling the knife from him. I felt the gush of blood pour over my legs, sticky and hot. My every breath was labored, ragged, filled with anguish. Glenn's breath came much slower, but just as ragged. Long moments passed between them. Peyta stood over me, singing a death song. It couldn't be anything other than a death song. It drained me of hope as Glenn was drained of blood, his life force red and steaming on the frosted grass. The other men were praying. I could hear the fervent tones of their pleading. They were praying for Glenn's life. He couldn't even look at me now. He was seeing the beyond. His next breath could be his last. There was nothing left to say. I kissed his colorless lips and wept. From the bottom of my hollow soul, I wept. My life no longer worth living, but unable to die and go with him just by wanting to. "No!" Peyta shouted, but it wasn't in response to my despair. I looked up, disinterested, to find her pointing toward the spring. I followed her gaze and saw Gable standing in the water, the knife in his hand. "What?" I asked, confused and dazed with grief. Gable plunged the knife into his heart and pulled it out again, dropping it with a tinkling sound on the stones of the well's retaining wall. The blood splashed down into the waters of the dead spring, and the earth trembled. "I'd give my life as a ransom for his," he yelled with the last of his strength. His eyes found mine and lingered. The earth shuddered again. Blood for blood, I'd give myself to the dead spring. I pay for his life. Take me instead." The arms of the spring's previous victims reached up and began to drag him down into oblivion waiting for him. His focus never left my face. The elf, so consumed with guilt and grief that he'd spent the past 10 years drowning in booze, was now free. His eyes no longer held that dangerous edge. They were full of love and a profound peace. His handsome face smiled, that Ellenbill wonder just visible over the edge of the stones. Then he was gone. A gasping breath snapped my attention back to Glenn, and I was thrilled to see the color coming back into his face. His back was healing. I could feel the flesh knit together beneath my fingers where I'd been trying to staunch the flow. Each breath was less haggard than the last, and the light returned to his eyes. He tried to smile. The wounds of his mouth refused to cooperate, but I saw it nonetheless, beaming brightly from his heart. "Hello, beautiful," he whispered. Everyone sighed in relief and chuckled, a reflex reaction. Then we sobered, and everyone, even Glenn, looked toward the dead spring. The only thing left of Gable Ellenbill was the blood on the blade of the knife as it rested on the dismal gray stones. If you enjoyed this chapter, please give it a like and/or a comment. And if you think someone else might enjoy the story, please share with them the first chapter. If you subscribe and turn the notification bell on, you'll be the first to know when the new chapter is released.